Welcome to History Hack. If you didn't know by now, we are the revolution. That means we're sharp, witty, lots of fun, but it also means that we're essentially the peasants in Les Mis huddled round a table in the corner of the bar with no money. If you enjoy the show, please do support us. We have a Patreon account by which you can donate a small monthly sum in appreciation of what you're hearing. Alternatively, we have Ko-fi, in which you can just do a one-off donation as a thank you if you particularly enjoy a certain episode. Either way, we massively appreciate all of your support. Hope you enjoy the show.
Hello, welcome to another episode of History Hack. You have me, and yay, we're doing something ancient. It's been ages, and I'm so excited. Beth, who have we got on today?
So today we're speaking to Islam Issa, who's an Egyptian-British scholar and author, and a professor in the School of English at Birmingham City University. His research has included early modern English literature and the reception of the Renaissance. But today we're very excited to be talking about the city of Alexandria, which he explores in his new book, Alexandria, the City That Changed the World.
Hello! We haven't had you on for ages.
Last time I was here, I was talking about Cleopatra.
Yeah, I think, God, it was right at the beginning of us doing our recordings, right? So we're going back in the middle of COVID.
It was, yeah, it definitely was during COVID. I remember that vividly.
Oh, my days. It's so nice to get you back on because we've been dying for ancient Egypt for so long. I don't know what's wrong with your friends, but apparently they just don't want to help us out. So, you know, get the word out.
Well, you know what? The Alexandria book starts with the ancient, but somehow it ends up in the present. So it's a really long history.
Oh, that's all right. I mean, listen, we talk about Alexandria, we talk about the library, we talk about, I mean, it's in all the, let me put it this way. You struggle to find a book that doesn't somehow mention Alexandria. It's such a important and, do I want to say well known? Is it that well known?
Well, I mean, it's one of the most important ancient capitals, and it was, a regional trade hub, and it was the knowledge capital of the world for centuries. But at the same time, people tend to go to the Mediterranean and go to Egypt and not end up in Alexandria, or they might go to other ancient capitals like Athens, Rome, Istanbul, and not Alexandria. So that is intriguing.
Have you been?
Of course, I'm from Alexandria. My parents are my grandparents, great-grandparents. So it's a personal endeavour as well.
Oh, my days. Do you know how much cooler this has just become, this podcast? I mean, I thought we were going to do some really awesome history stuff anyway, but now you've got a personal connection. That makes it so much more amazing that we're being able to. And hold on, you've got to tell us a bit about your family. Hold on. Let me stop jumping the gun. You've got to tell us about your family, but we'll do that at the end. But before that, I mean, Alexander the Great doesn't. Let me put it this way: Alexandria exists before Alexander the Great, right? So before he arrives, it's still an important city, isn't it? Why is it so important?
I mean, it's not a city when he arrives. It's a series of fishing villages on the Mediterranean coast, and it's an island that's actually uninhabited. So the importance that it has isn't so much a result of the people that are there or what's going on there. It's two main things. The first is the location. So this island and these fishing villages are on the Mediterranean. They've got access to water because they're relatively close to the Nile Delta, but without risk of flooding or drying affecting it. And it's got a lake behind it to the south, and a canal network that the ancient Egyptians had built. So that's one part. The other part is it's at the intersection of three continents. So it's North Africa, it's right next to Asia, and it's just across from the Mediterranean Europe. So it's at the intersection of three continents. So that's the importance of Alexandria as of those fishing villages and that island as in terms of location. But then there's also a mythical importance to it, and that's that the island of Pharos is mentioned in Homer's work, Homer's poetry. In Homer, we tend to think of Homer now as a poet. At the time, Homer would have been seen as much more than a poet. Homer would have been seen as history, and with the absence of one scripture, religious scripture, would have been seen as having some theological importance as well. So the fact that in the Odyssey, the island of Pharos is mentioned, and legend has it that Alexander, who was taught by Aristotle, by the way, loved Homer's poetry, that he kept a copy in a golden casket that he put under his pillow before he went to sleep, and that he had a dream in which a venerable man with a white beard, maybe Homer, told him about this island where loud the billows roar, and as a result, according to Plutarch, he gets up immediately and goes to this island where he ends up connecting it to those fishing villages on the Mediterranean coast to create the city of Alexandria.
Oh my days, I love that. That is so... I'm struggling to find my words of what I'm trying to express here. But yeah.
Yeah,
anyway.
it is quite a radical vision. Like, it is building a city from scratch. Usually cities are created as a result of a war or geographical divisions or expansions, which isn't the case for Alexandria. It's not so organic. He actually has a vision, goes and delivers that vision, and it's got two really radical ideas as part of it. One of them is that if you create a city at the intersection of the continents, and you bring people from all different parts of the region to live together in relative harmony, which does happen for some time. So he invites Greeks, the Egyptians are there, Levantines are there, Jews come in big numbers because he offers Jews to live in peace there with to build their synagogues and tax exemptions, so they come in big numbers. So if you gather all these people in one place in relative harmony, then they can turn this place into an economic hub, into a trade center, and to some extent that dream is realized. The second radical dream, I think, is that knowledge is power, which leads to things like the library, but we can talk about that separately, perhaps.
Sorry, I'm just jumping in before Beth all the time. Beth, I promise I will give you a second in a minute. Coming back to this for everybody and all people. So it's theoretically similar to the idea of Pan-Hellenism, where even though that's just for all Greek-speaking people, so for people to be able to share ideas, to be able to gather together, to be able to pray, but this is literally for everybody under the sun. Doesn't matter your religion, doesn't matter your race, doesn't matter where you're from, literally everybody to gather in one city and live in harmony.
Yeah, and Alexander would have probably been expected to Hellenize rather than harmonize. But I think what he does is something quite radical. He actually leaves as soon as he finds the place. Doesn't see a single building go up in the city. He's ever excited for his next adventure. And part of what he tries to do with Alexandria is be in a strategic location where he can expand eastwards, because Alexander does want world domination. So he doesn't see it through himself, but certainly the Ptolemies who come after him try to keep up that vision. And there's evidence of people coming from all around the region, from the south, Nubia, even from as far as India.
You mentioned before mythology in terms of Alexandria, the city, and I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about how Alexander the Great tried to kind of tie himself to previous mythology in kind of showing why he should have a role in Alexandria and Egypt and other areas. How did he kind of try and utilize myths for his own advantage and his image?
I mean, the simplest thing I can say is that when he arrived in Alexandria, he had styled himself on Achilles. So even his hair with its sort of curly locks, and then he also had a specific sculptor and a specific portrait artist. So he was very conscious of his image, of who was allowed to portray him, and the way in which they portrayed him. And often when he was portrayed, he would look like Achilles. And then over time, that kind of subverts when people artists try to depict Achilles, they begin to make him look like Alexander. So he has that kind of influence as well. The other aspect of it isn't just that he tries to tie himself to those who've come before, but he creates his own legend. So during his life, it's actually Aristotle's nephew, who he hires as his sort of biographer, and with all his travels, he has these biographers with him. Ptolemy, his friend and general, who later takes over Alexandria, also writes about Alexander's adventures, and we end up with the Alexander romances, which are all these legendary stories about him that people keep adding to the extent that even after he dies in Alexandria, they start adding to them. The Jews of Alexandria add certain stories about him going to Jerusalem. When the Muslims arrive, they say that he was mentioned in the Quran. So it's really about creating his own legend, and to a large extent, he's very successful in that.
Right, you've mentioned this, and I think we should continue on with the story of the library. First of all, if you Google it, you have the most beautiful, obviously you can't get photographs because the photographs didn't exist back then, but you've got the most beautiful artworks, paintings of this library. My question to you is, first of all, was this the largest, one of the first of its kind? Is this something that was just so beyond imagination to have such a library created in Alexandria? And what happened to it?
We go back right to the beginning, where legend has it that Alexander started scribbling the design of the city into the sand when he arrived, and that he included something called the Shrine to the Muses, which is where we get the word museum from. But also the Shrine to the Muses is this complex that was going to be built that has both a library where the books are held and a museum where research is conducted. Now, the library itself, we know that when it's built, there's a letter from the period, the letter of Aristeas, which has the kind of job description, if you like, of Demetrius, who's hired to build the library, or to gather the books, and his task is to gather all the books in the world. That is the job description, all the books in the world. So it's very much intended to be a repository of all human knowledge up to that period, and to a large extent, we can say it is the biggest gathering of books or scrolls or human knowledge to that period. We've got the second librarian, for example, is quoted as saying that there are 500,000 scrolls. So it's a huge quantity, and it includes the entire, for example, corpus of Greek literature. So yes, there was this library that really did try to gather every book in the world from different languages. They went to extreme measures to get these books. They would borrow them with huge deposits from other governments and not return the deposits. If your ship docked into the port in Alexandria, it would get searched, not for contraband, but for books. If you had a book, it would be confiscated immediately and taken to the library. And in the library, it would be copied, and in all likelihood, you'd get the copy and they'd keep the original. There were policies that you couldn't take any originals out of the city as you were leaving. So there were policies put in place to ensure that they could meet this goal. I mean, another one is that they banned the export of papyrus so that libraries like in Pergamon can't compete. So there is a massive intention here, a clear intention to gather every book in the world. And that's the radical vision that knowledge equals power. The Ptolemies are saying, if we gather all knowledge and then we also research and disseminate the knowledge, then we will have power, a sort of form of soft power. Now, the library itself is likely to have been a really grand design. It would have had columns, large columns inside and outside. There would have been sculptures on every corner. But we have very limited information about how it looked for certain. We know it had main halls, and that the cabinets were ceiling high, and that the scrolls are all there, like wooden logs. And eventually the librarians start to organize them by subject. They attach little labels of clay to them so they can be identified without being unrolled. They eventually catalog and alphabetize, which are things that hadn't been done before that. So that's an answer to the library and what existed there, and what the intention was. As for the demise of the library, it's something that happens over time. And actually, I think the library is often a kind of symbol for the priorities of a city or the priorities of a government. And we see that today as well. And over time, we have stories about the shelves being emptier when Christianity enters. there's a lot of books destroyed, and many of these sort of what would have been termed pagan philosophers begin to leave the city, and they may have taken books with them. Before that, actually, in 44 BC, obviously Julius Caesar sets a fire in the city that may have extended, caused some damage to the library. So it just happens that it's over time, really. We've got lootings, we've got earthquakes, tsunamis, changing politics, changing religions, until over time there's a decline. It's not just one event per se that causes the downfall of the library.
That's really interesting, because when you talk to people in general, they're like, oh, so the library was just set on fire and everything was destroyed. That is the myth that you're going to have to battle now, because that's how everybody rolls it. That was it. It was completely and utterly destroyed by one fire. All the works of the ancient world disappeared because of that one fire.
I mean, that being said, fires were quite common in Alexandria. There was a kind of a mob, and the population kind of didn't let things go differently to how they wanted. They would often, set fires or protest, or get the ruler and take them to the stadium and sort of behead them. And so it was, there were periods of real unrest in Alexandria. The most famous fire, like I said, is around is in the 1st century BC, when Julius Caesar sets a fire, and he writes that. His autobiography is really interesting. It's in the third person. It's like Caesar did this, Caesar did that, and he does say Caesar set a fire, but he sets it to the ships on the harbour, and it may have extended into the library and caused some damage. But what it certainly destroyed is books that were being held in the kind of overflow, because they had a kind of overflow of books, both in the temples, in the kind of sister library, and in the warehouses around the harbour. So it's true that Julius Caesar's fire may have destroyed books as well. But we also know that Mark Antony, for example, gave books as a gift to Cleopatra in the library. So it would have existed after then. So that fire wouldn't have destroyed it completely, Caesar's fire, but it would have damaged it.
It's such a fascinating history just of that one building and all its repositories. Like, we could have done a whole podcast just on the library, but we're going to move on. So can you tell us a little bit about what the Hora was?
Yeah, I mean, I've kind of hinted at this already, but there's lots of horror in the history of Alexandria. I mean, I discover in a letter that there was cannibalism in the 11th century. But there are two primary things that I mention in the chapter on horror from the 3rd and 4th centuries. The first is the Roman Emperor Caracalla, who rules from 198 CE, so towards the beginning of the 3rd century. He massacres thousands of people, mainly men, in the city. And the second thing is the earthquakes that struck the city as well. So those are the two kind of key events in that part on that chapter on horror. Like I said, the Alexandria mob, they had a lot of success in changing politics in the city. So if they didn't like one of the rulers, they could protest enough and cause enough havoc for that to change. And with that came the library, where they were writing. The museum next to the library, where they were writing poetry and comedy and so on. So when those two things combined, satire began to exist in Alexandria. So they really did ridicule that the nicknames they have for some of the Ptolemy rulers. One's the chickpea because his head looks like a chickpea shape. One is, there are some really rude ones I'm not going to mention. So they find this Roman emperor like a really good target for their ridicule, because he had a really bad relationship with his wife. He killed his brother. He said that he was the new Alexander. He was quite tiny, like his stature, and then they started to call his mother Jocasta, in reference to Oedipus sleeping with his mum and so on. In Greek mythology. So all of this stuff reaches the emperor. So when he passes through Alexandria in 215, he essentially gathers all the men there are two different versions of this in the histories. He gathers all of the men, and they are all slaughtered, thousands and thousands of them slaughtered, 25,000 people, and throws them into a fire as a result. So that's the, one of the most horrific events that takes place in Alexandria's history. And Caracalla actually gets killed by one of his own soldiers later, not that long later. And in Alexandria, they celebrate his death. At the time, it was a sort of anniversary of his death, was a celebration. The other sort of big moment of horror was in 365, so 4th century, when a tsunami took place. So a huge sort of an earthquake, and then suddenly the tsunami. There were, from the eyewitness reports, there's one Roman historian who is an eyewitness called Ammianus, who writes about boats being stuck on the roofs of houses and people being immediately drowned, neighbouring villages just being wiped off the map, and also the farmland becoming just too salty to work anymore. So big damage to the farmland as well. So those are two of many horrific events that happened, but those are the two that really strike us from the 3rd and 4th centuries.
We're going to jump a little bit forward in time because obviously we'd love to sit and talk with you for hours, but we also want people to go and read your book. So we're going to be jumping a little bit here, but eventually Alexandria comes under Islamic control, doesn't it? What happens under Islamic control?
Yeah, so Alexandria is also a huge hub for Christian theology for large periods as well. Well, essentially, what the idea is that Alexandria is a kind of liberal city where, as we've mentioned, people can sort of be themselves. That was the idea. And that's why the Jews went there, and that's why the Christians went there in a period where Christianity wasn't as strong. As for the Muslims, it's slightly different. It's not so much to escape oppression; it's more to expand. It's not well known actually that the person who led the Muslim army into Egypt, Amr ibn al-As, went to Alexandria while before he was a Muslim on a trade trip, and that Muhammad, the Muslim prophet, prophesies that Egypt will become a Muslim nation, and he's very interested in Egypt. He sends letters to which we still have access. He sends letters to the prefect or the high priest of Egypt, who's usually assumed to be Pope Cyrus, but he's probably Pope George I, and they exchange very respectful letters. And the Pope sends him several presents from Alexandria, including a beautiful woman called Maria the Copt, whom Muhammad weds. So there is an interest in Egypt as the Muslims expand. Eventually, the Muslim army digs trenches on the city's outskirts, and they attack the Roman or Byzantine army unexpectedly. And the histories don't really tell us how that worked, that strategy, but they tell us that it worked, that the trenches being dug did work, and that they took Alexandria, the Arabs took Alexandria to end 7 centuries of Roman rule. And what happens then this is the year 642, so we're talking almost 1,000 years after its founding, is that for the first time Alexandria is no longer the capital. So Muslims who take Egypt are a bit wary of Alexandria because it's on the sea, and that they're more interested in land. They're from the Arabian Peninsula, so for them the desert makes more sense than the ocean. And the second thing is it's a very diverse city, so that's quite confusing for them. They're not used to this kind of diversity. So they found a new capital, which is Fustat, which is now Old Cairo. So Alexandria is a capital for a good millennium, but 973 years, to be precise, after its founding, it becomes a Muslim city that's no longer the capital.
And we're going to jump forward again in the kind of whistle-stop tour of Alexandria, a bit further into the medieval era. And we have to mention the Crusades, which, just such kind of huge part of medieval history in Europe and the wider globe. How would you describe how Alexandria's fortunes fared during the Crusades? I mean, I imagine with different Crusades, there's kind of varying events and different things going on. But how would you kind of tell us about that?
Yeah, I mean, to summarize, I think for long periods, it's used as a defense fort against the Crusades because it's got naval presence. So, yeah, I think for a long period, it's a defense fort. But we do know that, during different crusades, there are attacks on Egypt. They're often unsuccessful. So King Amalric of Jerusalem gets quite close to Alexandria, but the Egyptians open up the Nile down and stop the advance, for example. One of the really important moments is in 1166 in Alexandria, when the Crusaders arrive, and we've got a good account of that, a clear account of that from the chronicler William of Tyre. But his emphasis is interesting because he writes about how the Crusaders basically cut the trees, cut the orchards, and that was a sad moment for the Alexandrians in the 12th century, especially as in Islamic belief. Then they're not allowed to harm trees during war. But William of Tyre writes that they leveled the orchards to the ground, and that they were doing it for the sole purpose of just I think he writes causing injury and loss. It wasn't tactical. It was sort of to affect the morale. And this event, I think, tips the balance in 1166 because people realize in Alexandria that the Crusaders are bad news when they do that to the trees, and the Alexandrians join forces with the Seljuks, who are led by Saladin. So Saladin is the one who leads that, and eventually Saladin's uncle puts him in charge of Egypt as governor. So later, I think, talking of Saladin, when Saladin in 1187, there's his famous attack in Jerusalem. What's not well known is that the Crusader troops then turn to Alexandria, and that the Alexandrians then start to throw, and they still find them today, sculptures and random blocks of pillars and columns and stuff onto the seashore, so that the Crusaders can't get any closer to Alexandria. And throughout all of this, there's something important to mention, which is throughout all of the Crusades, Jews move in big numbers to Alexandria to seek refuge. Even no matter who the attack's from. When the Crusaders attacked the Jews moved to Alexandria because it was safe for them. When Saladin took over Jerusalem, Jews moved to Alexandria because it was safer to them. So that's another consequence of the Crusades, is that the Jewish population was really rife in Alexandria.
Like I said and Beth said, we're jumping in time a little bit. I mean, recently we did a podcast on the Ottoman Empire. I don't know if you can do one podcast on the Ottoman Empire. You'd probably need about 65 because it's so vast and covers such a wide time period. But Alexandria gets taken over by the Ottomans for a few centuries. Do they improve things after the Crusades?
It's almost no surprise, isn't it? You can see all these consequential empires through the history of Alexandria. The history of Alexandria is a history of so many different groups and empires because it's such an attractive location. So as far as the Ottomans go, from the 15th to the 18th centuries, those are probably the quietest centuries in Alexandria's history because the Ottomans don't prioritize Alexandria for large periods of that time. They make quite drastic changes to the trade routes and to the immigration patterns. They've got other cities that they're prioritizing in the region that are not Alexandria. As far as the actual city is concerned, the causeway that Alexander had built between that barren island and the Mediterranean coast, they expand that, and that's something that still exists today. They expand that and basically move the the city into that area. But the population really declines because there are other more attractive places to live with better employment opportunities than Alexandria. And also, it combines with a time when Vasco da Gama found a different route around Africa to Asia. So that kind of Cape route where you go around Africa into Asia. So the fact that the Europeans were beginning to have their own empires and find different trade routes meant that Alexandria's importance in linking East and West began to diminish. So really, it lost its monopoly on things that it had, like the spice trade, and it began a kind of a decline that one could argue it's never recovered from as a result of the Ottoman period.
And we're going to jump forward again to Napoleon. And having watched the film a couple of weeks ago, all I have in my mind when I think of Napoleon in Egypt now is him firing at pyramids. So yes, but we're going to think about what he was actually, the real history of Napoleon in Egypt. How did Napoleon Bonaparte fit into Alexandria's story specifically?
He did fire at the Eliyahu Hanavi synagogue in Alexandria. So the synagogue is destroyed by Napoleon's army.
But not the pyramids.
Not the pyramids. Not the
like pyramids, in the film.
Not the pyramids. I mean, until today, people often ask whether the Sphinx's nose was destroyed by Napoleon. But again, that's a legend. So, but he did destroy the synagogue. So in Alexandria, and that's an interesting fact, because he admired Alexander the Great. And I think that's an interesting entrance into this story of Napoleon, is that he really did want to emulate Alexander in some ways. He was obsessed with him. And if you look at his the kinds of things he says while he's in exile later in his career, he says things like, Alexandria would have been a better city than Rome, Constantinople, Paris, London, and Amsterdam. He says it would have been and was meant to be the head of the universe. So he saw huge potential in its location. And he says other things like Europe is a molehill. Tiny Europe has not enough to offer. So he really thinks that Alexandria could be the answer to his Alexander-like quest for world domination. So he's got these ambitions, he's got these delusions, much like Alexander. He arrives in Egypt and he tells his troops that they're about to enter an historic city, and that he wants to be greeted as a liberator in the same way that Alexander was greeted, because Alexander had got rid of the Persians in Egypt who weren't very popular. Now, as Napoleon enters Alexandria, a bullet shaves his left leg. So that's his welcome to Alexandria. And he asks his troops to respect the mosques and places of worship. But like I said, ironically, they blow up the Eliyahu Hanavi synagogue because they want to erect a fort in its place. So before even setting foot in the city that his hero founded, he'd already destroyed and damaged important parts of it. He's obviously ends up fighting against the Ottomans and the British, and that culminates in the Battle of Alexandria in 1801, and the capitulation of Alexandria is signed by the British and the French, and that gives the British control of the city. So he's ultimately unsuccessful in his quest to keep Egypt or keep Alexandria. It does have an influence on lots of the culture of the city, in the sense that they found these obelisks. It's quite funny. They found these obelisks that were transferred from Heliopolis Temple to Alexandria in the year 13. So this was when Octavian took Alexandria from Cleopatra, the last Cleopatra, the 7th. He transferred these two huge 15th century BC obelisks from a temple in Heliopolis to Alexandria and erected them in front of the Caesareum. And the Caesareum was built in honor of Caesar by Cleopatra and finished by Octavian. So these two big obelisks are then named Cleopatra's Needles by the French even though they have absolutely nothing to do with Cleopatra. And obviously, one of them ends up in London and the other ends up in New York. And they still have that name, Cleopatra's Needles. So that's something that happens during Napoleon's time.
Okay, moving on to, well, you just mentioned my next question, really, which was the British now have Alexandria. Do they do a better job than the Ottomans, the Crusaders? God, I'm losing how many people have occupied the city now, but previous occupiers, do they do a better job?
I mean, it's a time when the city has some importance. Again, you know, they do take Egypt, but they also place British troops there, and that in itself was quite curious to the people of Alexandria. Why are there thousands of British troops placed here? And they also, for large periods, put an Ottoman in charge, sort of a ruler, a kind of puppet leader, essentially. And they lend a lot of money to those Ottoman rulers, or the rulers that are there. So Egypt starts to stack up a lot of debt, and then we realize why the British kept their troops there when the world wars begin, because it's a great location in which to have your troops, and Egypt plays a role in the world wars. And the Suez Canal is perhaps another thing we should mention, that links east and west again, which is initially going to be built by the French, and to a large extent the British oppose it because they think it would give the French an advantage over them. So there's a period where they really try to put their focus on keeping and taking control of the Suez Canal. So yeah, there are British warships in Alexandria, British troops. There's a heavy shelling of Alexandria that almost destroys much of it as well in the 19th century as well by the British. So it's a fluctuating period, but essentially it's important for British global politics that they're there.
And you've mentioned the World Wars and the Suez Canal, and these will be familiar to some listeners for particular events in the 20th century, the repercussions of the First World War and the kind of rise of independence protests and revolutions in particular parts of the globe, including Egypt, of course. How important was Alexandria during particular kind of key events of the 20th century, such as that kind of mission for independence, and then later we have the Suez Canal crisis? What kind of would you pick out, I guess, even in a couple of minutes for the 20th century as key Alexandria moments?
Yeah, there are lots. I mean, it's a city that just has one event after another. The 1919 revolution is essential. It's an independence movement that centers in Alexandria and results in independence from Britain. So in 1922, Egyptian independence is declared, and it shifts the country from a protectorate of Britain to a kingdom. Britain still kind of de facto controls it, but that was a really important moment. It was also an important moment in terms of the Egyptian suffragette movement. So the 1919 revolution is really tied in with lots of women's movements as well. You know, you also have the 1952 revolution, which centers around Alexandria, in which the army generals, and the most famous of them is Nasser, Gamal Abdel Nasser. Nasser, who's from Alexandria, whose father was my great grandfather's postman, which is why that chapter is called The Postman's Son. He essentially leads a coup against the monarchy, and from Alexandria, the king Farouk is forced to flee, and he leaves the palace in Alexandria onto his famous yacht, and Egypt is no longer a monarchy and becomes a republic. So that's in the 50s. There's the 73 war with Israel, which you know my parents vividly remember as well. So there was a lot there in Alexandria. And then, like you'd mentioned, the World Wars, the First World War, has consequences on the city. So again, the Jews who are not Ottoman citizens moved to Alexandria during that period. In the Second World War, with the challenges that the Jews are facing, then they're rejected by many places like the US, but they are welcomed in Alexandria. So there's that aspect. I mean, it's kind of links to the previous question, but the British never leave between the two wars, and that becomes clear why so many warships remained in Alexandria between World War I and World War II, because overnight in World War II, Alexandria becomes the British Navy's largest base on the Mediterranean, and Britain swiftly pours troops into Alexandria, and I think it's an unacknowledged sacrifice today, actually, that over 1.5 million Egyptians were conscripted into the war effort for the Allies. Is probably something that most people don't recognize. So there were more than 1 million Egyptian soldiers in World War II, and 500,000 peasants became laborers in what was known as the Egyptian Expeditionary Force. So I think that's also an unacknowledged aspect of Alexandria's history.
You just inspired me. We now need to find a historian that works on that time period in Egypt, because that story deserves to be told. Because we don't talk, there's so many aspects of history we just don't talk about. We're so Europe-centric.
Yeah, and in Alexandria now, there's the Hadra Cemetery, like Hadra. The Hadra Cemetery has First and Second World War graves, thousands of people buried there.
Just to finish off, tell us a little bit about your family, because I'm really intrigued. I need to know more, because you mentioned it at the beginning. And how far back can you trace your family from Alexandria?
Well, I begin the book by saying that I'm the 100th generation of Alexandrian now, or the 100th generation can call themselves by that name, based on how long the city has existed. I also say that I tried to find Ancestor the Great, so not Alexander the Great, Ancestor the Great. And in a way, I failed, because it's very hard in Egypt to find written records. It's not quite the same as National Archive. They're both more poorly preserved and harder to access. So I couldn't really find that Ancestor the Great. However, I did do a few things. I got my dad to do an ancestry test just for the sake of it. I thought, are we going to have a really interesting mix of all these different groups that lived in Alexandria? And it came back 97.5 Alexandria, which was intriguing, because I'm not sure quite what that means, but he was happy. And, when I was there and doing my research in the archives and stuff, I also sort of went to family members that I wouldn't ordinarily have gone to, like great aunt's husband or people like that who can tell me about the family history. And I think the kind of unsung hero of the book is actually my late granddad, who makes appearances, because I think I'm constantly intrigued to think what would he have made of all these changes happening to his city. He's born in 1910, so he lived through all that stuff that we've just mentioned, and sometimes have to speculate about what he'd have thought, and sometimes there are little signs about what he would have thought.
I love that. I think that's a perfect ending to this podcast. Islam, you are awesome as always. Thank you so much. Remind our listeners before you go the name of your book.
It's called Alexandria. Alexandria, the city that changed the world.
Fabulous. We'll get that into our bookshop, and we will also make sure that you get a slice of the money, we get a teeny tiny slice of the money, and the man who has a company named after the rainforest doesn't get the largest slice of the money. So it would be amazing to be able to see your book come out a little bit more. You need to come back, because I think we need to delve into some of these aspects a little bit more. And I've now been inspired to learn a bit more about Egypt, especially outside of ancient Egypt, because that's all people focus on when they talk about Egypt. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, I think every chapter of this book could have its own podcast episode, couldn't it?
And don't tempt me.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to chat.
Our incredible guests give us 45 minutes of their time to join us and talk about their work or their new book. This is just a small taster. As a result, we have launched our very own bookshop on bookshop.org, where you can find our guests' latest books, You can support them and you can support us on History Hack. 10% of every sale via our bookshop supports the podcast and allows us to keep going and bring you more top-of-the-line guests. You can find our bookshop at bookshop.org/shop/historyhack or search for us in the shop section. Thank you so much for your continued support. We really appreciate our listeners and supporters. So make sure you get down to the bookshop and grab yourselves a new book.